Tonight, there is a stunning claim that could change everything in the Nancy Guthrie case.
Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on the notification bell and make sure all notifications are on because investigators believe Nancy Guthrie didn't open that door for a stranger. She opened it for someone she knew. That one detail changes everything about this case, and the more you look at the evidence, the harder it is to look away. This is not guesswork. This is not a theory someone made up on the internet. What you are about to hear comes from verified sources, law enforcement reports, and analysis from FBI behavioral experts who have spent decades studying exactly this kind of case. Everything in this video is tied to the active investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. No names are being thrown around without reason. No conclusions are being pushed without evidence. This case is still open, and it is moving fast. And so let's start at the beginning. Not with emotions, not with assumptions, with facts. On the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared, something happened before she ever went missing. Something that most people glossed over when the story first broke. At 1:47 in the morning, a security camera near her home was removed. Not broken, not malfunctioning. Removed. Somebody took it down. Then at 2:12 in the morning, a motion sensor picked up movement near the property. 15 minutes later, at 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker went silent. The signal that had been tracking her heart simply stopped transmitting. And after that, Nancy Guthrie was gone. That is what we know. But it is not what explains this case. Because what an FBI behavioral expert just confirmed changes everything. Think about what that sequence actually means. Somebody knew that camera was there. Somebody knew where it was mounted, how to get to it, and how to take it down quietly in the middle of the night without triggering anything else. That is not something a random person figures out in the dark. That is knowledge. That is familiarity. That is someone who had been to that property before or had spent time thinking carefully about it. Then the motion sensor goes off. Then the pacemaker disconnects. That is a timeline with a shape. It has a beginning, a middle, and a terrible end, and it was planned. But here is where the case takes its first major turn, because planning something and executing it perfectly are two very different things, and this person, whoever they are, did not execute it perfectly. They left something behind. They left behavior, and behavior, as any FBI analyst will tell you, is one of the hardest things in the world to hide. The footage that investigators recovered shows a figure approaching Nancy's front door, and the way that figure moves tells a story all on its own. There is no rush. There is no darting looks over the shoulder. There is no hesitation at the edge of the property, no pausing to check if anyone is watching. The figure walks up to that front door the way someone walks to the front door of a house they have been to before. Calm, direct, unhurried. Investigators and behavioral analysts have a word for it. They call it a saunter. This is not how a stranger behaves. Think about that for a second. If you were somewhere you were not supposed to be in the middle of the night, about to do something you knew was wrong, you would not saunter. And your body would betray you. Your pace would be uneven. You would glance around. You would move like someone who knows they do not belong there, because your nervous system would be screaming at you. That is what fear looks like on camera. That is what guilt looks like before the fact. This person showed none of that. Multiple experts who reviewed the footage came to the same conclusion independently. The movement is confident. The approach is direct. There is no sign of someone mapping out unfamiliar terrain. Every step is placed like someone who already knows where they are going. That kind of comfort in an environment does not come from watching a house from a distance. It comes from having been inside it, or close to it, or around the person who lives there. Removes all doubt, builds certainty. And that is what the footage does when you watch it through the eyes of someone trained to read behavior. But then something interesting happens. Something that cuts against the idea that this was a polished, experienced criminal. Because for all the planning that clearly went into this, there is a mistake sitting right in the middle of it. A mistake that points to something important about who this person really is. They did not account for every camera. They came prepared. They came armed. They had clearly thought about this ahead of time, and yet somehow a camera caught them, not the one they removed. A different one, which means they knew about one camera and not the other, which means their knowledge of that property was partial, not professional, not complete. They knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to disappear without a trace. And when they got to the door and realized they needed to get inside, they did not use tools. They used a plant, a potted plant near the entrance, something already sitting there, something anyone who had visited that house might have noticed in passing. That detail matters more than it sounds. A professional would bring what they need. An amateur uses what they find. And using what you find means you have seen it before with your own eyes. This was not a professional. This was personal. The figure in the footage is also carrying what appears to be a weapon, and at first glance, that reads as terrifying. But the more the analysts looked at it, the more complicated that picture became. The holster is wrong for the weapon. The gloves being worn would make the weapon significantly harder to use quickly and effectively. And there is a real possibility, based on what investigators have noted, that the weapon may not have even been functional. So why bring it at all? Because the weapon was never meant to end something. It was meant to start something. It was a tool of control, not violence. It was there to make Nancy comply, to make her afraid, to make her go along without a fight. The goal, at least in those first moments, was not to hurt her. It was to take her somewhere, to move her. And that changes the psychological picture of this entire case in a very significant way, because you do not go to that kind of trouble to control someone you have never met. You do not plan a removal. You do not scout a property. You do not show up in the middle of the night with a prop designed to terrify a specific person unless you know that person, unless you know what scares them, unless this is about something that already exists between you. And that brings us to the moment that a veteran FBI behavioral analyst says is the key to this entire case. The door opened, and in that moment, Nancy Guthrie's brain did something that human brains have been doing for thousands of years, something that happens faster than thought, faster than fear. Her brain recognized him, not because she saw his full face, not because she had time to think it through. Recognition does not work that way. It does not wait for you to process. It does not ask for confirmation. It fires. It hits you like a wave before you even know the water is there. A shape, a posture, the way someone holds their shoulders, the sound of a breath, the way a person shifts their weight when they are standing still. These are things your brain has filed away without you ever asking it to. And when it matches what it sees to what it already knows, it tells you instantly. He was masked. But that was not enough. Because Nancy had seen this person before. She knew the way they stood. She knew the width of their frame. She knew something about the way they moved, the way they existed in space, that no mask could cover. And in the fraction of a second that it took for her eyes to travel from the peephole to the open door, her brain had already made the match. That is what the FBI behavioral analyst believes happened. And it is not a stretch. It is science. Human beings are wired to recognize the people in their lives through far more than just faces. We read posture. We read gait. We read the tiny, unconscious habits that every person carries with them everywhere they go and never thinks about. The tilt of a head, the way someone breathes when they are nervous, the particular stillness of someone trying very hard to look calm. And here is the part that matters most for this case. That recognition, that split second of knowing, changed everything that was about to happen. The plan this person had built depended on one thing above everything else. It depended on Nancy not knowing who was at her door. It depended on her fear being directed at a stranger, an unknown threat, someone with no face and no name and no connection to her life. Because that kind of fear is paralyzing. That is the fear that makes you comply. That is the fear that makes you go quietly. But the fear of someone you know is different. It is not paralyzing. It is activating. It makes you fight. It makes you scream. It makes you reach for something, push back, refuse to go without leaving a mark on the world that says something happened here and someone did this to me. The plan depended on anonymity, and in 1 second, that was gone. Now look at what the physical evidence tells us about what happened next. There was blood on the porch, not inside the house, on the porch, outside, which means the struggle did not happen in the living room or the hallway. It happened right there at the threshold. It happened immediately. It happened because something went wrong the moment that door came open. A plan that was supposed to be clean and controlled turned into something desperate and reactive. The blood tells you that. The location of the blood tells you that. If Nancy had been quietly and successfully moved from inside her home, there would be no reason for blood to be outside on the porch where anyone walking by could see it. That blood is the physical signature of a plan falling apart. And this person came in expecting compliance. They got resistance instead. And that resistance, that moment where Nancy refused to go along quietly, forced a shift in everything. The removal became a struggle. The control became chaos. And whoever was standing on that porch in the middle of the night had to make a decision they had not planned for. That is the turning point of this entire case. Not the camera going down, not the motion sensor, not even the pacemaker signal cutting out. The turning point is that moment on the porch where a carefully constructed plan met a woman who recognized who was standing in front of her and refused. Now here is something else that does not add up. In the days after Nancy disappeared, messages were sent out claiming she had been taken for ransom. Somebody wanted the world to believe this was about money. That Nancy was being held somewhere and that a payment would bring her home. But those messages were not sent to her family. They were sent to the media. Think about that. If you had taken someone and you wanted money, the very first people you would contact are the people who love that person. The people who would pay anything to get them back. The people who would not go to the police if they thought it would put someone they love in danger. That is how ransom works. That is the logic of it. Sending messages to the media is not ransom. Sending messages to the media is performance. It is misdirection. It is someone trying to shape the story, trying to point investigators and the public toward a narrative that leads away from the truth. And to make it worse, there was no proof of life, no photo, no voice recording, and no verifiable sign that Nancy was even alive when those messages were sent. This was not about money. This was never about money. So if it was not about money, what was it about? That question is where this case reveals its most important layer. Because the answer, when you look at everything together, points in one direction. This was personal. This was targeted. This was the result of something that existed between this person and Nancy Guthrie long before that night. You cannot target someone you do not know. You cannot scout their property, learn their camera positions, understand their routines, know which door they use, know what is sitting on their porch well enough to grab it in the dark without having a connection to that person or their world. Yeah, the level of specific knowledge required to do what was done here does not come from research. It comes from proximity. It comes from relationship. It comes from time spent close enough to someone that the details of their life become familiar without you ever meaning to memorize them. Revenge is one possibility. A personal grievance. Something that this person felt had been done to them or taken from them or denied to them that they blamed on Nancy. Something that had been building. Something that had been sitting in them long enough to turn into a plan. Long enough to turn into a night where they drove to her house in the dark and took her camera down and walked up to her front door like they owned the place. You cannot target someone you do not know. And investigators know this. They have known it for a while. The suspect list that has been built in this case sits at somewhere between 18 and 24 names. Those are not random people pulled from thin air. Those are people connected to Nancy's life, people whose names came up through records, through relationships, through the kind of methodical detective work that most people never see, but that is happening every single day in cases like this one. Gun store records have been pulled. Investigators have been tracking purchases, checking what was bought and when and by whom. Walmart purchase records have been examined. The gloves, the holster, the specific items seen in that footage all leave a trail. Every purchase leaves a trail. And in the digital age, that trail does not go cold. It sits in a database waiting for someone with the right warrant to pull it up and follow it to a name. And this is not random. This is narrowing. And then there is the DNA, because the struggle on that porch, the one that happened when the plan fell apart and the blood hit the ground, did not just leave a visible mark. It left a biological one. Mixed DNA was recovered from the scene. It has been sent to a lab, and it is now being processed using genetic genealogy, the same technique that cracked the Golden State Killer case after decades of silence. The same technique that has reopened cold cases across the country and delivered names that investigators had been searching for years. This is how cold cases get solved. Not with luck, with science that does not lie and does not forget. So take everything that has been laid out in this case and hold it together for a moment. The calm walk up to that door. The confidence of someone who belongs there. The camera that got removed and the one that did not. The plant used instead of tools. The weapon built for control, not violence. The blood on the porch. The fake ransom sent to the wrong people. The suspect list that keeps getting shorter. The DNA sitting in a lab right now waiting to speak. Every single piece points to the same conclusion. This person knew Nancy. This person had a reason. This person made mistakes. And those mistakes are the thread that investigators are pulling on right now, one careful inch at a time. So, who in Nancy Guthrie's life fits all of this? That is the question that has been sitting at the center of this case from the very beginning. And the answer, based on everything the evidence points to, is closer than most people realize. This is not a case where investigators are staring at a blank wall, wondering where to start. This is a case where the wall is covered, where the pieces are there, where the work being done right now is not about finding a direction. It is about building something strong enough to hold up in a courtroom. There is a difference between knowing and proving, and that difference is exactly where this case stands today. Let's talk about what investigators actually have. Because the public picture of this case, the one that gets reported on and talked about online, is always going to be a fraction of what law enforcement is actually working with. That is by design. You do not lay out everything you know about a suspect while the investigation is still active. You do not tip your hand. You do not give someone the chance to run or destroy evidence or change their story to fit what you have already found. So when you hear that investigators are being quiet, that is not a sign that nothing is happening. That is a sign that something very specific is happening, and they do not want to disturb it. The suspect list of 18 to 24 people did not come from guesswork. It came from a process. It came from pulling every thread connected to Nancy's life and following each one to see where it leads. Family connections, professional relationships, people who had access to her property, the people who had reason to be angry with her, people whose names appeared more than once when investigators started asking questions in different directions. That list is not static. It has been shrinking. Names get removed when alibis hold up, when evidence rules someone out, when the behavioral profile stops fitting. And the names that remain are the ones that keep fitting, the ones that the evidence keeps pointing back toward no matter which angle you approach it from. The gun store checks are a critical piece of this. The weapon seen in that footage was specific enough in its appearance to give investigators something to work with. The holster type, the size, the general profile of what was being carried. When you know what you are looking for, you can start checking purchase records. You can identify who bought something matching that description in a certain window of time. You can cross-reference that against the suspect list and see where the overlap falls. In a case this targeted, in a location this specific, that overlap is not going to be a long list. It is going to be a short one. The Walmart tracking matters for the same reason. The gloves seen in that footage, the specific items this person brought with them that night, those things were bought somewhere. Nobody walks into a situation like this using things they already had lying around the house. They prepare, and preparation leaves receipts. It leaves surveillance footage in store parking lots. It leaves loyalty card data and credit card transactions and timestamp records that place a specific person in a specific store buying specific things a specific number of days before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. That is not circumstantial. That is a timeline. That is a story told by data that cannot be coached or contradicted. And then there is the behavioral evidence layered on top of all of it. Because investigators are not just looking at what this person did. They are looking at what they did after, how they behaved in the days and weeks following Nancy's disappearance, whether their story changed, whether they inserted themselves into the investigation in ways that felt off, whether they showed knowledge of details that had not been made public, whether their grief, if they performed any, looked the way grief actually looks, or looked the way someone performing grief thinks it should look. Behavioral analysts are very good at spotting the difference. Real grief is messy and non-linear, and often inappropriate in its timing. It hits people at strange moments and goes quiet at moments when you would expect it to be loudest. Performed grief follows a script. It peaks when there is an audience. It says the right things in the right order. It is concerned with being seen to be grieving more than it is consumed by the actual loss. That difference is visible to someone trained to look for it, and in a case like this, that visibility matters. The fake ransom messages are also still being examined, because sending those messages required a device, a phone, a computer, an account, something that generated a digital fingerprint at the moment of sending. And that fingerprint, even if the account was created to be anonymous, leaves traces. The cell tower it pinged, the IP address it routed through, the writing style, which analysts can match against known samples of a person's communication, the way a handwriting expert matches a signature. Digital forensics in cases like this is extraordinarily precise. And whoever sent those messages to the media instead of to Nancy's family made a choice that felt smart in the moment and left a trail they may not have accounted for. Nothing about this case suggests a person who thought through every consequence of every action. What it suggests is a person who thought through the action itself and assumed the consequences would not catch up with them. That is the profile. So someone who planned the night, but not the aftermath. Someone who prepared for getting in, but not for what would happen when the plan broke down on a porch with blood on the ground and a woman who knew exactly who was standing in front of her. That kind of person makes more mistakes after the fact than before it. Because before, they had time to think. After, they are reacting. And reaction is where people reveal themselves. Reaction is where the wrong thing gets said to the wrong person at the wrong moment, where a detail slips out that only the person who was there could know, where the alibi has a gap that did not seem important to fill because they did not think anyone would look that closely. Investigators are looking that closely. Now let's talk about the DNA one more time, because this is the piece that carries the most weight in terms of where this case is going. Genetic genealogy is not a theory. It is a proven method with a proven record. It works by taking DNA recovered from a crime scene, building a genetic profile from it, and then running that profile against public genealogy databases to find biological relatives of the unknown contributor. From there, investigators build a family tree. They trace it forward through generations until they arrive at a list of candidates who match both the genetic profile and the other known details of the case: age, location, connection to the victim. In the Golden State Killer case, this method identified a man who had evaded capture for over 40 years. 40 years of silence, broken by a DNA sample and a family tree. In case after case across the country, the genetic genealogy has delivered names that traditional investigation could not reach. It does not matter if the person has never submitted their own DNA to a database. It only matters that someone related to them has. A cousin, a second cousin, a distant relative who did an ancestry test out of curiosity and never thought about it again. That is enough. That is the thread that unravels everything. The DNA recovered from Nancy's porch is in a lab right now. It is being processed. It is being compared. And when that process completes, it is not going to produce a list of possibilities. It is going to produce a direction. And that direction is going to point at someone whose name is probably already on that shrinking list of 18 to 24 people. This is how cold cases get solved. Not with luck, not with a confession. With science that is quiet and patient and absolutely relentless. So bring it all the way back to the beginning, to that figure on the footage, walking up to Nancy's front door in the middle of the night with the calm of someone who has been there before. Think about the camera that came down at 1:47 in the morning. Think about the motion sensor at 2:12. Think about the pacemaker going silent at 2:28. Think about the blood on the porch. Think about the fake ransom sent to journalists instead of family. Think about the gun that was never meant to fire. Think about the plant used as a tool by someone who had seen it sitting there. Think about the struggle that only happened because the plan required Nancy not to know who was standing at her door. And she did. Every single piece of this case connects. Every single detail feeds back into the same picture. A person who knew Nancy. A person with a reason. A person who planned carefully enough to be dangerous and carelessly enough to leave evidence behind. A person whose mistakes are now being assembled, one by one, into something that will hold. Investigators are not struggling to find him. They are working to prove it. The case is active. The investigation is moving. And the people working this case know things the public does not know yet. They are not lost. They are not stuck. They are building. And when that build is complete, when the DNA comes back and the purchase records align, and the behavioral analysis is submitted and the suspect list reaches its final name, that this case is going to close in a way that answers every question that has been sitting open since the night Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The only question that remains is the one investigators have already answered for themselves. So who in Nancy Guthrie's life fits all of this? They already know.